Imagine a winter morning when the canals of Holland wear a skin of ice, and the city moves more by breath than by footsteps. The bell on the Westerkerk has only just finished speaking, when a man in a heavy cloak pushes open the door of a tavern on the edge of Amsterdam's market quarter. It smells of peat smoke and wet wool and the faint sweetness of beer. Inside, the room is quiet enough that paper sounds like thunder. A contract slides across a sticky table. Their hand, ink-stained, impatient, comes down on it. The numbers are not for grain, not for herring, not for timber. They are for a bulb that will not see daylight until spring. Someone offers a house for what looks like an onion. Someone else laughs and agrees. Outside, ice shivers. A skater falls and gets up. And a city convinces itself that flowers are a new form of fortune. No one called it Tulip Mania at dawn. They called it opportunity, cleverness, taste. A thing begins not with madness, but with admiration. The tulip arrived in Europe like a rumor you wanted to be true. Fire-colored petals, strict geometry softened by silk, a flower with the posture of a noble. It traveled from the gardens of Ottoman courtiers to the notebooks of European botanists who tried to classify beauty with Latin. In Leiden, a scholar named Clusius nursed bulbs in a university plot, while the city around him learned to make money faster than anyone else in Christendom. Shares in the East India Company, insurance at the waterfront, ledgers as thick as family Bibles. In a place where capital was already a language, the tulip sounded fluent from the first syllable. Beauty alone does not build a market. Scarcity does the rest. In the earliest years, the rarest tulips were accidents of nature. A virus no one understood nudged pigment into flames and streaks, petals broken like candy canes or spilled wine. The gardeners saw pattern. The buyers saw rank. A bloom that could embarrass a neighbor's garden found a price without resistance. Bulbs changed hands in back rooms whose tables knew every kind of act but prayer. A successful merchant could take a guest to his courtyard and say nothing at all while a single cup of color said everything on his behalf. Price is a mirror held up to desire. Once mirrors multiply, rooms become fun houses. What began as collecting slid into trading, when collectors learned their neighbors wanted to be collectors too. The bulb itself acquired a reputation as an instrument that could travel without bruising. A small, durable promise people could pass from one ambition to another. By the time taverns in Haarlem, Alkmaar, and Amsterdam discovered that a drink tasted better when a deal rode beside it, bulbs had become less like plants and more like tickets, little ovals of potential, sold forward into seasons that had not yet arrived. Holland in the 1630s was a republic of habit and risk in equal measure. Ships left the Texel in convoys, so the sea would not eat them one by one. Investors spread their coin across ventures, because the world is large and accidents don't announce themselves. Tulips joined the same psychology. Hedge the voyage with a flower that seemed to pay out whether the wind blew kindly or not. You didn't have to lift anchor, brave capes, or fight privateers. You needed a name, a bulb, a signature, and a witness sober enough to testify that the signature was not a joke. A market is a chorus of reasons, and tulips collected them all. The wealthy bought rarity to confirm they were wealthy. The newly prosperous bought the appearance of old taste to teach themselves how to be comfortable in rooms they had only recently earned the right to enter. Craftsmen bought the rumor of a leap, one successful trade to lift them out of toil measured by daylight and into money measured by lines in a book. Students, bargemen, glaziers, painters, brewers, anyone with a winter and a plan found a way to believe that the right bulb could be a stair. The names themselves, Semper Augustus, Viceroy, Admiral. Leafkins felt like fortunes engraved on petals. It will be told, for it makes a better tale, that a sailor once mistook a priceless bulb for a kitchen onion and ate it with his herring and was punished like a thief. Whether or not the story is true matters less than the fact that it was so easy to believe. When prices deny common sense, anecdotes arrive to make the denial feel like theater instead of error. The rooms where contracts were made didn't mind the theater. It kept the tables full and the pens wet. The future had to be invented for tulips to peak. Bulbs are lifted from the ground in summer and planted again before frost. Most of the year, they lie asleep. Sleep is inconvenient for a market addicted to motion. So people created motion on paper, a traffic of promises. By winter 1636, notaries in cities across Holland were writing contracts for bulbs that would not be lifted for months. So a tavern could become a small exchange by dusk. A chalked list of varieties, agreed prices, a clerk whose pen never seemed to lift. This was called wind handle by the unkind wind trade. Because what changed hands was not a thing but the right to a thing when the season changed its mind and let gardeners put their fingers in the soil again. The rarest bulbs wore colors like heraldry, red and white like a soldier's sash, black-violet like a storm that forgets to stop at the horizon. The virus that caused such effects cared nothing for investors. It traveled where it pleased, revealed itself when it chose, vanished without apology. Uncertainty multiplied price because uncertainty multiplies hope. If a bloom was unpredictable, it became a lottery in which your name might be the one called. The more the market forgot that a bulb is a plant, the faster it attached meanings the plant could not possibly bear. Luck, genius, inevitability. Even tulip catalogues read like poems with prices in the margins. Amsterdam deserves its reputation as the first city of modern finance because it believed a book with clean columns was a kind of virtue. The same discipline that let convoy insurers sleep at night worked for most investments. It did not work for tulips. The old rules, diversify holdings, demand collateral, prefer reputable counterparts, were politely escorted out of rooms once a man had seen his friend turn a windfall from a bulb he had never seen bloom. When reason loses a vote to envy, it does not stop attending the meetings. It simply stops speaking. Sometimes a mania looks like a festival. In Harlem, winter evenings turned taverns into trading floors with pewter tankards for paperweights. Her farmer could pledge a future harvest for a chance at a stake in a famous variety. A carpenter might sell a future workbench to pay for entry at a table with men whose waistcoats had sat in richer chairs. Stories insist, again because it pleases the ear, that lists existed where a single bulb could be traded for an inventory that reads like the contents of a small farm. Wheat, rye, oxen, barrels of beer, a bed, silver cups, a suit of clothes. Whether or not such lists were satire, the truth did not contradict the flavor. Prices had run past the fences people usually keep around their fears. By January of 1637, all the elements that make a collapse obligatory had taken their places as if to watch a play. Leverage had crept into the room disguised as enthusiasm. Contracts had multiplied until their relation to actual bulbs resembled the relation between a rumor and the breath that carried it. A plague pressed its hand over the mouth of Harlem, and auctions paused because bodies do not respect price lists. Buyers in one city decided not to travel. Sellers in another decided to wait for a better day. A market that had learned to be brave in packs discovered that courage rarely survives solitude. The first failed auction did not sound like thunder. It sounded like a silence that refused to leave the room. A tray of bulbs sat on a table. The notary's pen hovered. No one stepped forward. A man whose stomach had been loud a minute ago found that it preferred to keep quiet. Someone made a joke, and even the joke seemed to understand that laughter would be rude. When people rose, chairs scuffed in a way that meant apology. The next night, the next room, the same result. Prices do not drop. They are dropped. Individuals do the dropping. One after another, hands stayed down, and the arithmetic that had seemed so companionable yesterday turned accusatory. Panic is not always loud. The crash looked like people finding reasons to be elsewhere, like merchants suddenly discovering urgent business at a distance from the taverns where the ink had run so freely the week before. Letters went unanswered. Partners went missing. An owner of a canal house who had felt rich because of a paper claim on a bulb he had never seen grew poor faster than he could rehearse a sentence to explain it. When prices run on belief, the day belief leaves is the only day that matters. Belief left in February. Officials tried to stand between debtor and creditor, with proposals that sounded reasonable. Could a buyer choose to walk away for a fee instead of a full payment? Could a notary's book be turned into a list of mutual forgiveness? Could courts declare that wind trade paper was a gentleman's sport, not properly subject to enforcement? Even the language of the law stepped gingerly, as if wary of disturbing a room full of sleeping dogs. In some provinces, a kind of settlement emerged. Buyers could cancel at a fraction, enough to sting, not enough to bleed out in the street. But a market is not consoled by rules written after the party ends. Confidence has no taste for the past tense. The debts that mattered most were not always measured in guilders. Reputations acquired a charge and then lost it. Friendships folded under the pressure of blame. The city learned to speak about caution as if it were a virtue rediscovered. Painters who had made pictures of pewter and bread and light on a wall, a quiet philosophy, continued their work as if to remind the country that value did not need to shout to be heard. Sermons turned to the subject more quickly than markets turned away from it. Pamphleteers invented villains and victims, and if the fables were not exact, they were useful. It will be argued by those who count for a living that the fever did not touch everyone. Anne Goldgar and others who have gone to the archives point out that the trade was not universal, and the catastrophe not national. The Bourse did not fall into the canal. The East India Company did not shutter its counting rooms. Much of the ruin lived in pockets, rather than on the whole garment. But stories choose their own sizes. Tulip Mania became large because it fit so easily over other bodies. It dressed later centuries, whenever people needed to explain why they had done a foolish thing with math. Inside the taverns, the lights went out without ceremony. A notary closed his book and permitted himself to notice how tired his fingers were. A man who had been proud of a contract peeled it slowly apart and used it to start a fire. It burned like any other paper. Outside, the canals released themselves from ice, as if nothing had happened at all. Spring came. Bulbs were lifted and planted. Blooms opened. Children pointed at gardens the way children point at anything that seems too bright to be true. To anyone who happened to be passing, thought the city looked richer when the colors were simple again. If a story stops here, it leaves you with a single lesson. Do not pay more than a house costs for a plant you cannot eat. But it is more interesting to follow the roots the other direction. Why did a flower become a currency? Because the Dutch had built a world in which value could be detached from objects and made to move as promises. Ships were promises. Insurance was a promise written by men who meant it, unless the wind was very unkind. Shares in companies that sailed to Java and back were a promise suspended on oceans and the health of captains. A bulb asleep in a cellar was more promise than plant for most of the year. In a system already addicted to paper, the bulb arrived already fluent. Consider the mechanics as a separate character. Taverns became exchanges not because people plan to make them so, but because tables are always available when winter is cold, and nobody wants to sit in a draft. A chalkboard is cheap. A clerk can be paid in beer. Bulb names have a flourish that makes them easy to say loudly. Futures contracts solve practical problems. No gardener wants 10 men knocking on his door in June, with disputes about who owns which row. Standardize the claim. Centralize the argument. Put a notary in the middle and value will pour into the neatness, at least until neatness begins to wobble, and the tidy lines become a net that catches nobody. There were warning signs, but warnings work only on those who are not busy succeeding. When an auctioneer whispers before an auction rather than after, when guarantors ask for collateral and receive a story instead, when a room answers, "What if?" With, of course, you can be sure a reckoning is napping behind the counter, waiting for the hour it prefers. Meanwhile, lists, real or apocryphal, circulated of goods traded for a bulb. Barrels of beer, cloth by the ell, livestock described as if each had a personality and an opinion about the deal. Ridicule is hindsight in costume. At the time, even a silly inventory felt like the beginning of a dynasty. The collapse did not kill the Dutch Golden Age. Pain humbles. It does not always halt. Ships still left harbor. Painters still taught light how to behave on canvas. The stock exchange continued to collect footsteps and decisions. But something subtle changed in the tone of the city's conversations. Prudence, an old word in a plain dress, became fashionable again. The proverb that rose afterward, honor above wealth, suggested not an analogy to gain, but a suspicion of the kind of gain that requires you to lie to your neighbor or yourself. People continued to love tulips. They simply loved them for reasons that did not require a notary. If you are listening for parallels, you will not have to press your ear to the door. 2 centuries later, Paris and London learned the same lesson with company shares instead of bulbs. Mississippi, South Sea. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, screens replaced ledgers, and numbers moved faster than any clerk could manage. .coms promised profits tomorrow that arrived with a maybe and a shrug. Houses became tickets to be flipped, rather than rooms to be slept in. Digital coins rose from code into charts that looked like bravado painted in neon. In each case, the oxygen was the same. A story people wanted to believe because it would be convenient if it were true. It is not cynicism to admit that stories make money move. It is a kind of hygiene. Tulip Mania teaches less about flowers than about audiences. Count how many of your reasons for buying a thing are borrowed from someone else's mouth. Notice whether you have imagined an exit that requires the door to stay open for you until you arrive, while closing quietly behind everyone whose footsteps you prefer not to hear. Ask if the beauty you admire would still be beautiful if nobody else saw it. In the rooms where money mistakes itself for a vote about the future, the calmest voices often belong to people who know where the exits are and are not in a hurry. The sailor and the onion returns at the end because fables do not care about footnotes. He eats the bulb. The merchant rages, the magistrate frowns, and the town laughs in a way that does not quite hide its jealousy. The joke survives because it flatters the listener. We would never be so foolish. It must have been those people back then. Yet the better use of the story is to swallow once and admit that, given the right winter, the right rumor, and the right neighbor's success, we might indeed have traded something serious for something that only looked like a meal. Imagine for a moment a house in Harlem, where a man has just lost a fortune and does not yet know what to tell his wife. He looks at a bulb, no different in weight or shape from last week's bulb, and tries to see in it the disappearance of a plan. He sets it down as carefully as if it were still expensive, because the hand does not learn as fast as the head. He sits. He hears a lantern move on a hook in the alley, and wonders whether the sound means gossip or comfort. He thinks of the summer to come, when the garden will look the way gardens have looked in Holland for generations. Neat, various, accomplished without noise. He has to decide what kind of man he is, in a room where the furnace is tired and the ink is dry. It would be tidy to end with a moral. Markets do not traffic in morals. They traffic in choices that collect into results. But there is a sentence that behaves well at the end of a story like this. Value is what remains when the story is over. The Dutch had to relearn that a bloom is a pleasure, not collateral. We have to relearn again and again that a rising line on a chart is not a biography, only a drawing. The future will offer us new flowers, themes, platforms, schemes, inventions with both purpose and poetry. Some will deserve applause. Some will deserve a handshake and a polite refusal. All will sound convincing when the room is arranged to make them sound convincing. If you have stayed with this tale from the first contract, slid across a tavern table, to the last bulb set back on a shelf, you already know why we tell it. The money of any age hides its most interesting arguments in plain sight. Tulips made those arguments visible. Hope against caution, imitation against patience, paper against earth. They turned Holland for 2 seasons into a mirror where the world could check its posture and decide whether it liked what it saw. If stories like this help you see the present more clearly, the ledgers beneath the headlines, the psychology underneath the price, then stay with us. Subscribe to the Money Codex, ring the bell and join a channel where we follow money. Not because it is loud, but because it is honest about what we want. There are more rooms to visit, more contracts to overhear, more mornings when a door opens and a city decides, one transaction at a time, who it is going to be. And if you step outside very early, when frost still writes its small messages on stone, you might find a garden where a tulip is doing the one job it knows how to do: stand still and be itself. Nobody ever lost a fortune looking at one. The harm arrives when we ask it to be a king,